Next to me now is the grave of Gobo Fango, who was killed in 1886, earlier than the Deep Creek murders as a result of the sheepman-cattleman conflict. But it's hard for me to find a way to characterize his life's story. He is a slave who found his way out of slavery. He is a black pioneer, and some people within the LDS Church say he was born in Africa who accepted the LDS faith, although there is questionable veracity to those claims because he was never actually baptized into the LDS Church. After I put out my video on the sheepman-cattleman conflict here on the Idaho-Utah border, I was contacted by Janice from Almo, which is just over the valley behind me, and she told me that her mother's cousins, the Hunter family, they knew Gobo Fango down when he lived in Grantsville, Utah. I'll tell the story about how that came to be in a minute, but essentially she said a lot of the facts I got in my story were wrong. The story has been retold dozens of times since the incident happened, and I also spoke with the grandson of Frank Carl Bedke, who actually killed Gobo Fango, and even though it's the family of Gobo Fango and the family that killed Gobo Fango, they are in agreement on a lot of different points. His story begins in 1855 in what was at that point Cape Colony, South Africa, at the beginning of the 8th of 9 Hoso Wars. And the Hoso Wars were pitting the Voortrekkers, colonists, against the British Empire, and against all of these were the Xhosa people, the native Africans. And this was causing mass starvation of the local tribes. So his mother, in 1857, I believe, places him in the nook of a tree and leaves him, hoping that somebody will pick him up. And this is the story that was told by the family who brought him to Utah territory. Well, 2 years later, the family who found him in the stump, the White family, they were baptized into the LDS Church and made their way over to New York on a ship. And because this was 1861, abolitionists accused them of bringing a slave. And they swore up and down, he's just our servant, he's our family friend. Behind me now is the ridge where Gobo Fango was shot by Frank Carl Bedke. And I wanted to relate a little bit more about Gobo's backstory because just like it's very easy to accuse the Bedke family of being racist or committing some kind of a lynching out here, it's also very easy to accuse whatever family brought Gobo of being slavers. Now the story goes, according to a descendant of the Hunter family, which later came to work with Bedke, that during the time he was alive in Africa, the chief of his village was trying to get the natives to attack the settlers, the white settlers. The idea that the chief had was to kill as many cattle belonging to his own people as possible to kind of create a situation where they would be starving and desperate to attack the white settlers. So Gobo Fango's mother tries to go and find the Talbot family, which is, you know, they have a homestead just along the way there in South Africa, but she's starving to death, so realizing she cannot really make it much further, she takes baby Gobo Fango, puts him up in the nook of a tree, and just barely makes it to the Talbot family, and they try nursing her back to health, but she later dies. They are able to save her baby because she naturally gave the baby the majority of her food, and as they were about to leave, Gobo Fango at that age, he was just old enough to understand that this was the only family that he could remember raising him. He was crying, so they brought Gobo Fango with them. And they made it through to New York, and apparently the people who boarded the train, they were not necessarily saying, we're looking for people smuggling slaves in. They were looking for escaped slaves, at least according to hearsay and rumor. Under her dress and managed to sneak him through into America, and they made their way out to Utah. Well, when he lived on their ranch, they kept him in the shed, and his feet froze, so he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. It was truly a hard life, and he was sold several times, even though slavery had been illegal for years. And the last time he was sold to a family of sheep herders. And when the Talbots immigrated over to Utah, they were all going through very difficult times. Apparently, Gobo Fango remembered fondly, and even the Hunter family remembered the Talbots very fondly, and there was a harsh winter, and they were all living in very rough homestead conditions. You can't compare getting frostbite back in the day with getting it nowadays. Many of the family probably got frostbite and probably had a very difficult time making ends meet, going hungry almost every night. Well, during Johnston's war, they all immigrated down to Grantsville because Johnston was about to lead 1/3 of the entire American military into Utah with the goal of annihilating the Mormons. A lot of them went further south and into lesser populated areas like Tooele, which was the capital was Grantsville, Tooele. Well, they head down there, and for a while while, he's, working with sheep. But the problem is there's another sheepman named Edward Hunter. Edward Hunter is the first bishop of Grantsville, first bishop of Tooele, and he's a very well-known, well-respected man. And one day he has the daughters of his first wife, they're off herding sheep, and some boys come up to harass them. It's, the sheep boys coming up to harass the sheep girls, and the girls beat the heck out of them. Well, his first wife says, "We can't have our girls out here anymore. They're not doing girly things. I want to have them at home playing with dolls and learning how to sew." So, Edward Hunter, he is kind of out of luck. He doesn't have any sons, so he goes to his friends, the Talbots, and the Talbots say, "Well, why don't we give you Gobo Fango?" And at the time, the bishop actually had another person in his house, an Indian. Now, we looked at Family Search, and apparently this Indian had escaped from jail, and they were feeding him and housing him and helping. I think it might have been a woman, but they were feeding them, helping them, housing them, because they understood what would happen if they got out and they were discovered to be an escaped convict and an Indian. So in their house, under the same roof, you had an escaped Indian from jail that they were feeding and helping, and you had Gobo Fango. Well, that family comes up here to the valley near Goose Creek, and the rest is history. Gobo Fango goes over the line and is killed under questionable circumstances. We don't know who drew their gun first, but it wasn't the story of a slave who'd escaped from captivity and was lynched. And by the 1880s, he was successful enough to have his own ranch and sheep herding business, now truly a free man living in Idaho Territory in a place called Goose Creek. And in 1886, the cattlemen of Goose Creek issued a non-legal edict saying all sheepmen are expelled from this territory. They said this has the basis in fact, so he stayed. But people hated Mormons, people hated blacks, and people hated sheepmen. So this was his mark of death. And in 1886, he met a German ranch owner, a German cattleman, a man by the name of Bidke, who said, "You're trespassing, get off my land." And Gobo Fango said, "I'm not. It's open range. Show me proof you own this land." And immediately, Bidke shot Gobo Fango in the chest. And the accepted version of events is that Gobo Fango crawled to a nearby barn and issued his last will and testament, which was to leave all of his money to the LDS Church and to the poor. Now, there's no evidence that this actually happened. It could have just been that the LDS Church said that it happened, but there is evidence to say that Gobo was a very pious man. He was very likely religious, but nobody really knows. And his death was a result of the 1886 part of this cattleman war in the same general area as the Deep Creek murders. And his story says a lot about the black pioneer out west. Apparently, Frank Carl Bidke was a cattleman. He came from Germany, or Prussia, in the 1840s. He was born there, and he decided to enlist in the German Navy at an age that was way too young. He lied about his age, and as their boat came up along New York, he and a few others jumped over the edge. Well, he couldn't speak any English, so for a while he pretended to be mute or deaf, and he made his way out to Butte, Montana, where he did cattle for a little while. He wasn't initially a cattleman. He was working in the mines, and he was trying to find out what worked right for him out west, and eventually he settled on cattle. Well, he was running his cattle from Butte, Montana down to Grantsville, Utah on a pretty common route. It was a long ways cattle route, and passing through this valley right here, he really grew to like it. Well, he came across a young woman down there in Grantsville, and her father was a Mormon bishop. So the bishop objected to the marriage, and he kind of tipped his hat and went back up to settle this valley. Well, a few years later, the family of the girl that he was interested in, they moved up just a few miles south of him in this valley as well, as a part of a wide-reaching settlement of the area. They lived happily ever after, and the story goes that this was cattle country. You had over there, just ahead of me, you had the area where a few years after Gobo Fango's death, the two sheep herders were killed in the Deep Creek murders, and that was Deadline Ridge. You weren't supposed to cross it. And it was widely understood for several years that the hills in the center of this valley were owned by the Bedke family, and you didn't cross them with your sheep.
So here's Alamo. And so here's the mountain that divides Alamo, and then Basin is just on the other side of this mountain.
Elba.
Okay, down here.
You got Elba is over there, and it's right straight across the mountain to the west of Elba.
Okay, and so Oakley's here?
Yeah, a little, yeah, right in there.
And then there's these little hills that divide Oakley, and then Burley is down here. Yeah. And so Bedke's had the land ranch, I think was the name of their holding, and they were kind of at the northern end
Basin.
of the basin. And the McIntosh farm ranch or whatever was at the other end of the basin. And Bedke married Polly McIntosh.
The story, as I've heard it from two generations of the Bedke family, is that the original homestead was right here. Frank Bedke had built it after coming down and settling the area, and he and a couple others were kind of the only non-Mormons in the area, and they were about to get on their horse and their wagon and head down to something of a sort of birthday party celebration at the McIntosh homestead right down there, and this is all in the middle of the basin. Well, as he's going, he follows this fence line here, and right over where this property starts to get a little bit green, there's a bit of a drainage, and the Matthews were sheep herders, and there was a lot of conflict between sheep herders because they had come in and they had basically by far outnumbered the Mormons, or the non-Mormons like the Bedkes, and they were basically settling in this part of southern Idaho. So the Matthews family, which was employing Gobo Fango, they sent him out here, and it's February, so it's a bit cold, so he's kind of beyond a little bit of a hill or a ridge. Now, I've heard two separate stories from members of the Bedke family, Eric and Eric's relative, that perhaps Gobo was shot here, and another one said it was kind of a little bit up further here. Immediately ahead of us in the basin is where the McIntosh home was, and that's where Frank Bedke and his family was trying to reach when they saw Gobo Fango kind of camped out on their property. And their home would be to the left, maybe a mile or so, and you can see that it would be easy to conceal a small herd of sheep. It's February, it's kind of, you know, he wants concealment, he wants to winter a little bit, and he probably would have been right behind this area. So as Frank tells his family to continue on, he just gets on his horse and rides it up into there to confront Gobo Fango. Well, I'm sure that Gobo was kind of looking to camp out in that area as a little bit of cover as well, because, I mean, he knows it's, you know, my property, your property, we're two families that don't really like each other, and the Matthews family sent down Gobo Fango to kind of not be a nuisance. There was nothing Gobo Fango could do about it, but they sent him down to be like, this is sheepman territory. And it wasn't, from what I've heard, a sheepman-cattleman conflict. It wasn't a race conflict. Both sides disagree that it was a race conflict. They both say, you know, my grandpa had not a racist bone in his body. It was a Mormon versus non-Mormon conflict, and the Mormons just so happened to kind of have the sheep herder interests at heart, and the non-Mormons were cattlemen. But anyway, the story is, as they're leaving on the wagon, they see beyond that small hill there that, you know, Gobo's camped out. So Frank Bedke says, go on, continue down to the homestead over here, and I'm going to go get my horse and go talk to Gobo. Well, these are both very hard men. Frank Bedke, he joined the German Navy at 15 and hopped into the New York Harbor at 16, and for a few years saved up enough money to go across the Cape of Good Hope and make it all the way over to the gold rush. And, you know, he's a hard man, and he's looked down the barrel of a gun, and he rides up there, and Gobo Fango says, "Are you Bedke?" And he says, "Yes." And because he's employed by the sheepherders, he says, "I'm going to kill you, Bedke." And apparently Bedke dug his foot into the side of the horse. It reared up and knocked over Gobo Fango. Bedke jumped on him, grabbed his gun, shot him. Apparently, according to the Bedkes, Gobo Fango died right there, and he rode back to his house, his old homestead right up here, and he got on his horse and he rode his horse over to Albion, which was the county seat at the time, and from there he signed an affidavit saying, yeah, Gobo Fango threatened my life, and we had to leave. But it was a clash of two impossibly strong personalities. An unstoppable force meets an immovable object, and it could have gone either way, but Gobo Fango died. When Bedke was down in Grantsville in Utah, at the same time, Gobo Fango lived there as well, so they might have actually known each other. Well, he didn't go out seeking to kill Gobo Fango, and that's pointed out by the fact that both Janice and Bedke's grandson tell me he was going on a couple-mile horse ride to go for a dinner. It was a dinner, it was a regular. At the end of the day, he was going to go down, and he sees Gobo Fango's campfire right up on top of the hills that divide the valley, which is where you are not allowed to cross your sheep. And these again are the hills that kind of delineate cattle country from sheep country. This is where Janice believes that Gobo Fango died. Again, this is directly to the west of the cemetery. I'm standing at the fence now, and the Deep Creek murders happened at a larger mountain range just beyond it in the background there. Cassia County was kind of a dividing area between the cattlemen and the sheepmen. They had their own territories, their own kingdoms, basically. And he rides up to Gobo Fango, and apparently, according to his grandson, Gobo pulls a rifle out, and Bedke shoots him. And according to the Bedke family, he died right there. Now, other families have different legends or stories, some of which might be true. Who knows? All we know is that Frank killed Gobo Fango, but we don't know for sure the details. Who drew their weapon first? Maybe Gobo Fango got a shot off first. We don't know if Gobo crawled, because I was talking to Janice, who claimed that Gobo actually crawled 4 miles into town and passed up the house of a woman who was very expecting. She was pregnant and close to birth. So he didn't want to scare her, and he crawled into town and dictated his will to the church. And the killing of Gobo Fango actually happened only a stone's throw away from the graveyard where Frank Carl Bedke is buried. Down in this direction is the town of Oakley, and if I zoom out here, this was long before there were any grazing allotments or Bureau of Land Management, and it was really just whoever got here first and whoever hired out the most people to enforce the law, the unofficial law of this is my land and over there is your land. Well, this huge valley was kind of claimed by the cattlemen, and they would say, do not come in past the ridge. Well, over here is the ridge, and these would be easily defined geographical features, and it was a known factor, a known quantity. You don't cross them. And apparently, as Bedke was on his horse ride from the town of Oakley or around there, further south to the opposite end of the valley, about midway between, probably on one of the hills right out in front of me, he saw Gobo Fango with his campfire. And according to the family, he drove up and Gobo went to go reach for his rifle and he shot Gobo. Well, according to the Bedkes, Gobo died right there. But according to Janice and the Hunter family, he crawled all the way back to the town of Oakley, passing up one farmhouse where he knew the woman inside was pregnant because he didn't want to scare her, and he dictated his will there. Now, nobody really knows for sure what happened. And I mean, Janice told me very poignant, she said, when I die, I want to have a conversation with everyone involved and see what it was like. What actually happened to Gobo Fango? It's very easy to level the accusation of racism, but when you suggest racism to their descendants, they say, absolutely not. Our grandfather didn't have a racist bone in his body, and it was a simple dispute over property matters. And this is exactly what is also pointed out by Gobo Fango's descendants, people that knew very closely and are related to the Hunter family that he came up with from Grantsville when they settled here. I was talking to the grandson of the Bedke guy, and he said he was going to dinner. It wasn't like he was going out to go kill him.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't say this had anything to do with racism?
Oh, absolutely not.
Did the Bedkes actually know him and were on good terms with him, or was it kind of just this incident?
Well, I don't think they would have ever been on good terms because there was...
He was a sheep man.
He was a sheep man, and he was a Mormon. As you said, according to what Suzanne Hannah found, they were headed to dinner. He looked up, and it's in the middle of February, so Gobo's wintered up on the side of the mountain, and he sees it there, and he's like, okay, I've had enough of this. We're just going to be done now. And he goes up to kick him off, and you don't know who fired the first shot. You don't know what happened.
So did Gobo actually have a gun on him?
I'm sure he did. I wouldn't be up in the middle of nowhere. They all carried guns.
Sheepers, everybody had guns.
You would have had a gun. Anybody would have had a gun. the story is, and this is in February, so we're in. I thought it was right during the time when they would have been fighting over the actual feed. This is just one more irritation in an ongoing battle, is what I think, because it's February when Gobo was killed. So obviously there's no pasture at the time. So
They just spend dry grass, dry pasture.
yeah. So when we went up with Suzanne Hanna and we're looking at it, Gobo, according to what her research was, Gobo was kind of wintered up here on the end, on these little low hills that separate Basin from Oakley. And he's wintered up here. And Bedke is going to Sunday dinner to take his wife over to her family. And as they go past, he sees Gobo up there. And it's just like, oh my gosh, do we have to go through this again? So it really made him irritated. I'm not sure. He must have taken his wife over to her folks and then gone up and told Gobo. Okay, I'm done.
This entire row of graves here is all unknown at the back end of the cemetery that has 2 men from the Deep Creek murders. And walking through this cemetery, I actually see dozens of graves just here alone. And I don't know whether to make these out as pioneer graves or as bodies that they found in the hills. And there's no real documentation either way, so I guess it's only conjecture, but fascinating to think each one of these men has a story. So it was one of those classical Wild West feuds that shouldn't be analyzed through the lens of 2022.